to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. Hi everyone, welcome to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. Today's episode kicks off Series 3. And in this series, I'd really like to spend just a good chunk of episodes talking about velocity and specifically the culture that we've created in softball around velocity. And what I would argue is really sort of the negative culture or sort of the misunderstood culture around velocity. So today's episode is going to be a little bit of an intro just to start to talk about the things that I have started to see when it comes to the concept of velocity, how we think about it, how our athletes think about it, the ways in which we go about training it, the types of things, the expectations we put on it. And in today's episode, I'd like to just really start to break out those categories. And then throughout this series, really kind of go into depth into each of those categories and even welcome in some guest speakers. I'm planning to have some coaches and athletes in the baseball world talk about their experience with velocity to truly start to point out the fact that we've created a culture here specifically within softball that is a little bit, in my mind, kind of warped. So first thing that I want to talk about, I think the concept of velocity, not too long ago on Twitter, it was like, a Twitter explosion when someone made the comment about velocity is the end all be all. If you don't have velocity, you can't play at the highest level. And other people were like, no, you can just be a spin pitcher. To be perfectly honest with you, in my mind, that conversation is kind of a waste of time. It's the wrong conversation. We all know how important velocity is. There's a threshold in which pitchers have to be able to reach in order to be effective, in order for break to be effective. So it's not about whether or not velocity is important. It is. Are there ranges of velocities? Of course, in which pitchers can be successful. Yes, and there are many factors and variables that will go into that. But the reality is, it is important. And it is a concept that I have found when I'm sort of in the trenches of coaching at S2 that I have found is on the front of everyone's brain from the time they are an 8-year-old pitcher to a 12-year-old pitcher, a 16-year-old pitcher, and a 22-year-old. It is a constant. It's something we all want to know sort of like how to unlock, how to untap. What is this sort of like mystery around how to gain more velo? And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I have just along the way, the information I've started to gather, the data we've started to collect that has really gotten me to this point where I want to have a full discussion about why I think we're on the wrong track when it comes to how we're positioning the idea of velo and the culture we're building around it. So first thing that I want to point out is that what we have found and what we know to be true about the development of young athletes is that when our female athletes have yet to get their first period, they're pre-pubescent, what I often find a little bit alarming is when in the social media world, coaches, pitching coaches, parents brag about a pitcher's velocity gains when they are 8, 9, 10, like she's hit her max of this. And I think like we will do, velo and radar guns for our athletes for them to just be excited, have a competition. But there should in no way, shape, or form be some sort of relationship that is given between what you're doing in training, who I am as a pitching coach, and what your velocity is. They are just physically developing. That is just a result of their physical maturation. So calling all pitching coaches, instructors out there who want to feel as if it's something they're doing, that it's allowing, these pre-puberty pitchers to go up in velo, we have to scratch that. And we have to, on the flip side, also scratch the conversation where we have parents asking, how can she go up in velo? It's like, well, she's 10. She hasn't hit her first period yet. Like there is no true way to develop velo as far as training is concerned. So that's a major like myth we have to start busting, and we have to stop as far as like how deep it's rooted in our culture. On the flip side, what we hear oftentimes, especially when we get assessments, when somebody calls us or contacts us about getting an assessment at S2 Breakthrough, they're all over the country. So this is certainly what I've realized is not a regional thing. All over the country, we hear stories like, she hit her max velocity. She was up to about 62, 63. And now it's like she either slid down a bit or she's plateaued. And so what we have to really explain, we'll get into the logistics of how old was she when she started her first period? When was she sort of at her peak as you're describing? When did this plateau start to occur? And almost always what's happening is that athlete, the time where the parent or the coach is starting to say she's plateauing is just, again, linked to her physical maturation. So she hits puberty, her body is all out of whack. She grows in height first and foremost. Then she grows in sort of in mass. She puts on weight. Her hips expand. She fills out essentially. And she has to sort of reconfigure or kind of understand, recalibrate this new body. So there's so much sort of like instability and change during that period of time. And then usually we're sitting about a year, sometimes 18 months after a female athlete receives her first period. And then that is essentially like who she is. That's who she really is. So it's not like I was with Sally, the pitching instructor, and we were doing great and we were hitting velo, we were going up, and now she's really hit a plateau. I think it's time to find someone else. It's so important that we understand the relationship between physical maturation, puberty, velocity, and really stop attributing it one way or the other to a coach or a training program. I think that's really the first piece that I think is sort of sitting at the foundation of a culture that I really feel like we've gotten wrong. Redefine the Circle is brought to you by Rapsodo Softball. Whether it's at the plate or in the circle, Rapsodo delivers all the data needed to enhance your player's development and to give us a platform to become more informed and better coaches. Rapsodo pitching is absolutely critical when it comes to maximizing your pitchers. In addition to measuring velocity, pitchers and coaches get a detailed look at all of the ball metrics that influence break. Spin rate, spin direction, gyro degree, spin efficiency. Together, these metrics tell a story about a pitcher's data profile. And to grow that profile and ultimately maximize what that pitcher can become, understanding the metrics is a must. Rapsodo not only provides high-level feedback in the moment, but also creates back-end reports so coaches and athletes can visualize and fully understand the entire story and how it's progressing. Rapsodo is such a powerful tool. Instant data, relevant metrics, innovative visuals, and don't forget the in-app slow-mo video that allows pitchers to watch their pitching patterns right alongside the ball flight metrics they yield. Bottom line, Rapsodo is a must-have in the world of player development. See the data, feel the results with Rapsodo's softball technology. In addition to that, some of the things that I have seen once an athlete is post that time period, she's 16, 17, now sort of, maturationally, all of the athletes are somewhat in the same boat. They sort of level that playing field. And it's really here that I probably see the most unhealthiest relationship with athletes and velo or coaches with velo. Typically, what I have seen is that most athletes have a very unhealthy relationship with velo in the sense that they have this idea of their max. I've hit my max velocity, which is 66. That's the max I've ever hit. And so every time I throw a pitch on any given day, throughout any time of the year, if it doesn't say 66 or maybe 64 or 65, I feel as if I'm a failure. And sometimes that expands beyond the athletes. I've heard stories where, an athlete hit 68 and she's in a scrimmage game and she's throwing 65, and the coach will describe that as being like down in velocity. So we absolutely, I think the base of this series is really about this discussion. We have created an unhealthy relationship with velocity. There's no doubt about it. It's important. There's no doubt about it. It might even be sort of like at the center of the variables, the performance variables that we're really shooting for. But if that's the case, that's even more of a reason that we have to understand it. We are putting insane expectations, unrealistic expectations on our young athletes, teenage girls, and then they are set up for failures. First thing that I want to point out is that when we are working with our athletes, you have to understand they are human, they are not robots. It is impossible for them to throw the exact same velocity over and over and over. I will get into this in a little bit more detail in future episodes, but we collect velocity on every pitch of every single one of our athletes every day that they're training. So we just constantly keep trends. And what we see is that usually velocity within a single day, within a single pitch type, so let's just take fastballs, within a single pitch type on one day, there's usually about a 5 mile per hour sort of range of what she's throwing on that day. So if she's throwing 60, her max is 68. On any given day, maybe she might even be sitting 62 up to 60, 67, 68. That's within one day, one pitch. There are so many things that go into velocity. Yes, of course, patterns, but patterns break down when there is fatigue. Patterns break down to even start the day when there are things like deficits with sleep, soreness, nutrition. There are so many variables that would have an influence on velo. So this idea at which someone could just sit there at a max, at a particular number even, just pitch after pitch after pitch is ridiculous. So that's another piece that I think really goes into this culture we've developed around velocity that is just simply we have to start discussing. When it comes to understanding how to actually train velocity, boost someone's velocity, there's so many things that go into it, particularly rest and recovery. So I'll spend an episode really going into when we feel as if an athlete is ready to start really like an active training program geared toward velocity. What does that look like? How much is rest and recovery factored in? Hint, there is a ton. I will say we are going to have multiple segments in this series where we talk about overtraining. What I would say is the number one thing that sort of holds velocity down is overtraining. And so I'll go into detail about what that actually looks like and what goes into it to really get athletes to be able to develop velocity or see if they can make a jump. This is a specific category of athletes. This is not your typical teenager. They're in the higher end of high school with really stable patterns if we feel like they can actively train velocity. And then potentially our college athletes. They got to have a really stable base in their patterns. We have to feel like they're strong enough, stable enough that they can really withstand the high intensity, really our training approaches of like feeding the beast as much as possible. So I will go into great detail about that concept in a future episode within this series. But the ways in which we kind of typically train velocity now are training approaches that are a little bit more chaotic, haphazard, like essentially go as fast as you can, throw as many arm circles as quickly as you can, run and throw, sprint, grab the ball, come back. What is very important to understand is this is not training velocity. In fact, this is just training fatigue. That's not the way that our motion operates. Our motion is about maximizing power in any given repetition and then break, and then maximizing it again, and then break, and over and over and over. That is what training should be centered on. Again, we're going to go into great detail about then how do you approach it. But the concepts of just I'm training velocity by sprinting, running, jumping, doing all of these things, what we have found when we've actually measured those drills is they're incredibly poor from a pattern standpoint. They're usually incredibly chest-led, posture is poor, and essentially the athlete is just sort of ripping that arm through. If we're radaring the drills like that, does velocity sometimes go up 1 or 2 miles per hour? Yes, because essentially what you're actually attacking are things like intent for the athlete to be like as aggressive and competitive as possible. But that does not mean that affects her overall velocity trend. That if we were then to continue to track her velocity day after day, week after week, month after month, drills like that don't have any impact. They just really hit upon intent within a given session, and while really promoting super poor patterns, which in my mind is sort of anti-velocity all along. So I think there are just so many pieces around velocity in the culture in softball pitching that really we have to put on the table and we have to start talking about. We've got to talk about what's real and what's not. Can an 11-year-old who hasn't had her first period even develop velocity? If she does, who is that attributed to? What is that attributed to? Once we sort of get over that threshold and bodies have stabilized after puberty, what is realistic? How can a pitcher be expected to go 12 months of the year, all year long, pitching at high velocity? I will tell you something right now, that is not a culture that exists in high-level baseball. We've created a culture in baseball pitching where we are like really sensitive about how to maximize velocity, what to do, intensity, volume, how they all work together. And it's like we throw it all out the window because it comes to softball pitching. The days are over where we say, underhand pitching is not as stressful on the arm, on the body. We know that is not true. And so since now we have that data, we have that research, it is time now to start to reflect on the systems and the cultures specifically around things like intensity, volume, velocity. What is it that we're actually, in my mind, the systems we're creating are just driving our athletes into the ground. So time to really put that discussion, put those details out on the table, start to ask ourselves, what can we do to start to reconfigure that culture? And how do we actually, again, not only recognize the importance of velocity, but because of its importance, start to now dive deep into how to understand what the expectations are around it, how to make sure we communicate that effectively, and how training throughout the year really should be designed in order to make sure that it stays in the priority in which we all really know it is. Thanks so much for listening today. I know that today was a little bit introductory. I just wanted to lay out really some of those many categories that really have start to, take me aback as I started to see how much velocity comes up in conversation with athletes of all ages in all parts of the country. So again, Series 3, we're gonna hit these topics in more detail each and every week. Hope you'll join us again each Monday. Look out for the next episode. Thanks for joining today. Take care, everyone. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.